Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm really eager to present this talk to you. I do have to start with a bit of a disclaimer, though. I've had people come up to me today and say, "Are you going to talk about so-and-so? Are you going to talk about so-and-so?" And I realized that the title may be a little bit misleading, okay? Because there were a group of founders of NEARA. I'm not going to be talking about them. We had a great talk today by Dennis Stone up at America's Stonehenge. He talked about the founders of NEARA, did a great job. I'm talking about the story behind the story. The founders of NEARA. This is back when there was no NEARA. No one had even thought of anything like NEARA. At most, it was a glint in someone's eye. Yeah, so we're celebrating 60 years of official NEARA history. But you know, the roots of NEARA go back more than that. They go back an additional 30 years. So we're going to be talking about a gentleman named William B. Goodwin. He was a retired insurance executive in Hartford, Connecticut. He had a passion for antiquities. Now, what are antiquities? Well, relics, remains, artifacts, evidence of remarkable and mysterious ancient human cultures. He was an antiquarian. Now, tomorrow we're going to hear all about antiquarians, so I'm just mentioning them in passing right now. But they kind of combine, at least in the case of Goodwin, they kind of combined for what we would consider totally separate things today: historian, archaeologist, antique collector, and treasure hunter. And believe me, Goodwin did all of those. So here's a picture of him in his later years. He had a very interesting life, and we're going to talk about that a little bit right now. So insurance was the family business going way back to the 1700s, and he was a part of that family business. But first, as a young man, he attended St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, which is a very famous residential boys' school. In fact, he was there at the same time as William Randolph Hearst. You know, if you've ever watched the movie Citizen Kane, it's based on partly on his life anyway. But Goodwin was a sportsman. He loved playing team sports like football. He was on the track and field team at Yale University. He was a rower. And then after university, he moved to Kansas City and he worked in a mercantile bank. But he was still involved in sports, very much so. He organized a football team, and it was based on rugby rules. He organized international competitions in a rowing race in 1890, and that sort of thing. You can see up there the different accomplishments. Finally, he moved to Seattle in 1891, and he was working as a director of a lumber mill. But he was still involved in sports. So in 1892, he founded the Seattle Athletic Club, and they won the championship in 1894, the Great Northern Railway Silver Cup. So this is when the insurance business started in 1895. So up until now, he was kind of spreading his wings as a young man, but the elders of the family finally settled him down and said, "Okay, you are an insurance man, my son." So he started in 1895 in Seattle, then moved to San Francisco a couple of years later. But what happened next? The gold rush. He couldn't resist it. He loved adventure. So for almost 2 years, he was up in the Yukon Territory, hunting for gold, seeking treasure. But he ended up working as a mailman more than anything else. And his health suffered too. It was very, very tough conditions. So he did return to San Francisco, but he's really starting to settle down now, because at that time he married his lifelong wife and true love, Mary Arabella, who went by the name of Bell, short for Arabella. But that's only part of who Goodwin was. He was an inventor, and not just a garage inventor. He actually has patents to his name. all kinds of different things. This is a patent for a rowing gadget, I think. Rowing appliance, it's called. Okay, and this one dates to, where is it? 1902. So this is while he was in San Francisco. This is another one for an oar, patent for a special kind of oar with hollow construction, lighter and stronger. What is this one? Holder for cigars. He got a patent on a cigar holder. This is more useful. It's a brake for a railway car. All right, so I'm just quickly going through this just to give you a flavor of the man. Like, he's not just like a boring guy in the library at all. So he did move to Columbus, Ohio in 1904, and he's moving up in the insurance business. I've kind of skipped over all the commercial details about his accomplishments in insurance. But in Ohio, while he lived in Columbus, Ohio, somehow he got involved with the Ohio mounds. From the mound builder culture, the Department of Highways needed to catalog them. And since he was traveling around visiting all the insurance offices in the state, somehow, I don't know if he was talking to the governor or how it went, but he got a contract of some sort to actually make a catalog of all the ancient mound sites in Ohio. And me and a few other sort of amateur historians have been trying to find a copy of that report. So far, we've not been able to. But somewhere in some dusty drawer in Ohio, there's a report about what he did on the mounds, and we're still looking for it. It seems like this is when he really started to get interested in antiquities. But then World War I happened. And he did go through officers training, but he wasn't sent overseas. He worked as an aide to the Secretary of War for World War I. Eventually, he moved back to Hartford in 1923, and he was even higher up in the insurance business. He became the secretary on the board of directors for the World Fire and Marine Insurance Company. Now, the big point about this, because he did retire soon after it, but because he was so high up in the insurance business, like secretary of the board of directors of a major insurance company who had lots of money, they gave him a personal secretary to use in any way he wanted to. And so all of his correspondence that he had for his hobbies, which was history and archaeology and this sort of thing, the secretary, he just dictated his, pardon me, he just dictated his material, and the secretary typed it all up, which he would then proofread and make little changes and so on. And also, if he got letters from other people who just sent him a scribbled handwritten note, maybe even in a foreign language, he would get those translated and typed up. Now, not every single time, but it's surprisingly a large number of times he was able to do that. So now, today, we can go to his archives, and it's all typed out, it's all translated, it's amazing. But that's because he was secretary for the insurance company. Now, the other big thing is very famous. In Hartford, there's this Athenaeum, which is like a museum, and he was a director of colonial arts for or curator for colonial arts and a trustee of the museum. Also, his brother and father were also involved in the museum. And so that creates a sort of an interesting conundrum, because sometimes the opportunity came to buy things that the museum wanted, but he felt it was a conflict of interest. Even though he could have done it, he then instead went out to try to find other people to do it, because it didn't want to look like being a trustee, he was self-dealing and trying to be personally involved in the transactions. So that is another way that his circle of connections widened. He had a huge circle of connections in commerce and politics and things like archaeology and history as well. So this is when he started his big lifetime project. He had in mind a multi-volume documentary history of Connecticut, going right back to the earliest days. So he pursued it with a real vigor to try to cover every possible angle, including sending teams of researchers to the United Kingdom and other places in Europe to try to find old maps and old charters and documents like that. He did eventually retire in 1931. And so now he was retired. He still had his secretary. And so he really started to increase the amount of archaeological and historical work that he was doing, as well as antique collection and all the things like that. He was particularly interested in old maps. And in 1935, the state of Connecticut celebrated its tricentennial, 300 years. And so he prepared an entire exhibition of maps of Connecticut. And he particularly wanted to get the oldest ones he could and show how cartography developed over the years. And so there's still, the maps from this exhibition are still available in the archives of the State Library of Connecticut, the Connecticut State Library and Archives. So let's talk more about what he was doing with stonework. Now, this is a cairn that is on Martha's Vineyard. And it's still not clear to me how Goodwin learned about this, but he called it the Little Cromlech on Martha's Vineyard. Now, cromlech is another word for a tomb that's found in certain parts of Northern Europe. And so this particular tomb is actually similar to some of the ones you would find in Scandinavia. Modern archaeology has not been able to confirm that this particular one on Martha's Vineyard it has any true ancient date to it. The archaeology that was done there only found modern artifacts nearby. But I think the jury is still out on this one because it wasn't disproved either, really. It was just, we just don't really know what it is. But Goodwin was quite convinced. And he says, of all the so-called evidence the Norsemen left on one or more of their various expeditions, told about in the historical Norse sagas, there are possibly two patent and indubitable reminders of their having once seen our master leaves in all their autumnal glory. So he's quite, florid in his prose. One of these is a small stone tomb still resting peacefully in a deep valley on the western end of Martha's Vineyard. And you can still see it today. It's still there. One of our members checked it out fairly recently. The resemblance of this little cromlech to others known as existing in Scandinavia today is too obvious to need any trained investigation. A famous last words, right? But anyway, so he's also quite famous for having excavated Fort Ninigret in Rhode Island. And so that one it's still, even modern archaeology can't make up their minds whether it was made by the natives, made by the Dutch, or made by the natives with help from the Dutch or what. There's artifacts from both cultures found there. He also wrote some books. He wrote 4 main books. And the first one was The Lure of Gold, published in 1940. And it claims to have located the exact spot where Columbus wintered his ships in Jamaica. So Jamaica was one of the places he went to in the winter to enjoy the warmer weather. He also spent a lot of time in Haiti and the Bahamas. But he started to get interested in the possibility of the Norsemen having come to New England. And so he wrote a whole book about that. At the time that he wrote this book, he was convinced that he had actually found the location of Leif Erikson's booths. And he had them pinpointed up around Portsmouth, New Hampshire, actually. So you'd have to read his book to get his reasoning behind that. I don't think it stood the test of time. But the most famous one for well, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Yeah. So, yeah, you can still find this book in the used bookstores, and it's quite a find if you can get your hands on it. So, another book the ruins of the Spanish and English ruins in Jamaica. And so this one is just chock full with archaeological reports as well, because those include Haiti and the Bahamas as well. Okay, so now we're getting to his most famous book where for NEARA is concerned, and that is the ruins of Great Ireland in New England. So this is his theory that the Irish had come to New England long before the Norse did. And so it's a little bit infamous because it was published in 1946, and mainly he had been working on this for years, and so many people were helping him with it. And there was a problem in that during the war, there was no, you couldn't get paper to publish books. It was a shortage, it was a paper shortage. But his publisher, Meador, called him up one day and said, "We've got a shipment of paper. Now's the time. If you want to publish anything, do it now." So Goodwin was actually ill at this time, and he just sort of told his secretary to send whatever they had down to the publisher. And he figured that the publisher would put his editors to work on it and straighten it all out. But in fact, the publisher didn't do that, and he figured Goodwin must have already edited it. So it's very disorganized. Sources are not cited properly. Some things are repeated. It's really quite a mess.
It's not the title Ruin.
The ruins, yeah, titled, right. All right, shifting gears a little bit, backtracking somewhat, his vacations. So he did vacation in the winter, in addition to going to Haiti and Jamaica, at a place called Mountain Lake in Florida, which was sort of a new concept in Florida vacations at the time. It was a brand new, destination. While he was there, he met another New Englander named William English Morse, who was a transplant. He originally was a Nova Scotian from Paradise, Nova Scotia, which is near Annapolis Royal, which is near where the first French settlement in eastern Canada was made at Port Royal. And so they struck up a great friendship, William English Morse, who was quite a character himself. He also came to Chester, Nova Scotia, which is right next to where Oak Island is. And so Goodwin actually was on Oak Island quite a bit, almost every summer, as well as doing archaeology up and around Port Royal. And so all of these are all in the archives, like the reports and letters and photographs and stuff like that. So this is a very elaborate inn called the Hackmatack Inn in Chester, Nova Scotia. So this is where Goodwin came every August. He stayed for the whole month of August, and he always wanted this one particular corner suite. He would write ahead, tell them, "Listen, I'm coming on these dates. Please have this suite available and ready for me." But this wasn't just any old inn. It was for the elite. It was actually built by a millionaire for his, initially it was just for his own guests, but they opened it up to the elite of the public as well, eventually. It burned down. So there's another long story behind the whole thing. I'll go past that for now. Here's a photo of William Goodwin in Annapolis Royal on holiday in 1936, along with a couple of other people. It's William English Morse who took the photo. This photo was published in a kind of a periodical that William English Morse published, but it didn't have a very wide circulation. It was mostly circulated among the folks who were at Mountain Lake in Florida. And so speaking of which, here's another one. So we've got Goodwin. Whoops, what did I do? Hit the wrong button. There you go. Anyway, some more people we don't know, but yeah, so this is another one that was published in William English Morse's periodical, as well as was this one. Now, here we're getting to a more interesting character, James Patrick Nolan, who was another one of these folks who was well-to-do and went to Mountain Lake, but he had his main residence was in Los Angeles, but he was a gold prospector. He would come to Nova Scotia in the summer and prospect for gold. So he was also on Oak Island. He's written up in R.V. Harris's book on Oak Island, but not very favorably. He had a gadget for finding gold that really didn't work, but he was pushing it. Anyway, we're going to bring James Patrick Nolan into this story because Goodwin purchased an axe from him. There's a whole long story about this axe. I'm going to only skim it tonight. It's not my main point, but Goodwin was very impressed by this axe. It had been found in northeastern Nova Scotia. Goodwin really thought it was a Norse axe. Now, you got to remember, this is 1938. There was no ransom meadows. There was really nothing that people could point to be sure that the Norse had come to the New World. As it says in the sagas, it was quite common to say, oh yeah, those sagas, that's all made up. Like it never really happened. But Goodwin was trying to find proof that it really did. And so he latched upon this axe and he thought, here is the proof, because this is a Norse axe. So he said, right? If there are any Norse axe experts in the audience, you'd know right away. Obviously not, but Goodwin thought it was. And so this is where he announced his find in the William English Morse Chronicle for November 1938. And so this is the article. And at the same time, he sent the same information to the local papers. So this is one from the Hartford Courant. Again, just bragging up the axe, saying, yeah, I've really found it now. This is it. We've got proof. So this is his article. And so continuing on for what I was just reading about, the other proof of the Norsemen. So the axe then is the other relic pictured here, found in 1935 on the coast of Markland, which was the saga name, which she claimed was for Nova Scotia. And he figured out that it must have dated to 1250 AD. And so one of the big arguments he had is that there are deeply carved runic characters on this axe. Well, are there really? We'll talk about that briefly in a minute. But so he did have the metal analyzed by a Harvard University PhD metallurgist. And according to the results that they found, they claimed that the Harvard scientists did tell Goodwin that it probably was a Scandinavian steel. So the way he worded it, he said, well, I can't really prove that it's not. Like if it's an ancient artifact, it would have to be Scandinavian. On the other hand, it could be modern. And he didn't come right out and say that, but it's kind of like you have to read between the lines. So these are some of the electron micrographs that he took of the steel, and he had his reasoning explain why it could be related. It could be a steel that had its origin in Scandinavia. All right, so now we're going to get into Olaf Strandwald, who is another big character in this story. So Olaf Strandwald wrote some books on runestones in North America. And so in Nova Scotia, we've got this stone called the Yarmouth stone, which is very controversial. Some people say it's a runic stone. Other people say, no, it's not. Well, Olaf Strandwald thought it was, and he thought he had a translation of the runes on the Yarmouth stone. So he wrote this book, and it's still a very popular book today, explaining the whole history of the Yarmouth stone, or the Fletcher stone, as it's also known. But he also wrote these other books, one in 1939, another in 1948, on Norse inscriptions along the Atlantic seaboard, or Norse inscriptions on American stones. So Goodwin reached out to Olaf Strandwald to try to get him to look at this axe and analyze what he thought were runic characters. Well, Strandwald could find runes where no one else could. And he was too good at finding runes. And that's the case in this axe. So if there are any runic scholars in the room, I don't think you've probably ever seen runes that look like that. But he called them, Strangwald called them dot and helmet runes. And he had his whole scheme as to how that could be translated into Norse language. I've never seen anyone else, agree with that. So I think it was very, sort of reaching out. But there are these three characters here, which is what he's referring to as a deeply inscribed runes. Now, the M character is kind of like a runic character, but the whole thing is kind of like reaching. There was another axe that Goodwin located around this time, which is in the Howland House. And here Goodwin correctly asserted that those two axes were very similar. And Strangwald even found a runic message in these decorations as well. To cut to the chase, and spoiler alert kind of thing, in modern research, we now know that these are actually axes that were manufactured in Eastern Europe, like in Russia or Estonia, and they were part of a commercial trade in the colonial times. They're not ancient, but they were purchased by traders in England from places like Estonia, and then resold in North America, as a commercial product. So now we know the full story, but back then they were really excited. Here's a picture of the Howland House, which you can still go there today in Plymouth, Mass, and see that axe on display in their artifacts. All right. Another important character in this whole story is Malcolm Pearson. So he was a young man. Goodwin by this time was an elderly gentleman. He had to have a driver to drive him around, which he always did anyway, because he could afford it. But Malcolm was like a breath of fresh air. He was a dynamo. He had all kinds of energy. And so he began to work with Goodwin. He was a photographer, and he worked in a manufacturing plant where he did the photography for the plant. So the thing about Malcolm is, in 1928, his family moved to Upton, Mass. And the property that they purchased is the location and the site of the Upton Chamber. They didn't know that at the time. It just looked like a hill. They weren't worried about it. But they soon found out there's this crazy cave inside this hill in our backyard. And Malcolm in particular was completely fascinated with it as a child. So as an adult, though, he wanted answers. Like, did the Indians really build this, as was the common explanation, or is there more to it? Like, how can we get to the bottom of this conundrum? So he started seeking answers to these questions. And so here, this is a picture of the doorway of the Upton Chamber, and this was taken a lot later, of course. This is Malcolm's wife standing in the doorway, but you can see how intriguing the site is. If you've never been to the Upton Chamber, I highly recommend a site visit. And so it's interesting because not only is it a chamber, but it also has this tunnel on the front part of it, which is not all of the chambers have that. So it made it quite fascinating. So somehow Malcolm got a hold of Strangwald. He was searching for anybody that might be able to answer his questions about this chamber. And Strangwald had published things in the newspaper about decoding Norse inscriptions. So he thought, okay, if this chamber was made by the Norsemen, Strangwald should be able to tell me something about it. So he contacted him. Now, meanwhile, Strangwald, who was from Prosser, Washington State, knew Goodwin from the time that Goodwin lived in Washington State. I'm not sure exactly how they originally met, but they did know each other. So when Strangwald was talking to Goodwin in 1936, he mentioned to him, oh, I got this letter from this other gentleman in Massachusetts who has got this incredible chamber he wants me to help him with. Maybe you would want to have a look at it. So that's how the sparks began to fly. So Strandwald is actually the one that connected Pearson and Goodwin to each other. But that was a real synergy because, Malcolm had the energy and the youth, whereas Goodwin had the money and the wisdom and the background in archaeology and that sort of thing. So it was a great team. So very soon after they went to the Upton chamber together, Pearson said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Goodwin, I read this newspaper article about this site in North Salem, New Hampshire. There's supposed to be other caves like the Upton chamber over there. We should go and check it out." So they did. And Goodwin was just blown away. He saw it as a whole village rather than just an isolated chamber. There was a whole village there. He'd never seen anything like it. So this is, if you've never been to America's Stonehenge, then you might not know what I mean, but there are all these incredibly complex tunnels and huts, and what they used to call them beehives back in those days, and sacrificial stone and things like that. So it's an amazing place to visit. We were just there today. It's great. So it's like the ad, I liked it so much, I bought the company, but he bought the site because he felt it needed to be preserved for science. It was too important. In those days, it was a picnic site. Like the local people would, on a Sunday afternoon, they'd make a picnic lunch and they'd go up in the ruins and kids would play, and whatever. And Goodwin, oh my dear, no, we've got to preserve this site for science. It's too important to have it as a picnic destination. So he did. He bought it, he fenced it off, and he began to do archaeology there. It was already known as Mystery Hill, really, but later, the name is now America's Stonehenge. So it's still a great, well, more so than ever, it's a great destination because now we've got a lot of knowledge as to what the site's all about. But in that day, it was mostly mystery. Now, so Goodwin is a complex character, and so at NEARA, we love Goodwin. I think he's great, but he did have a few foibles, and one of them is that he wasn't as careful about preserving things as he found them. Like if he saw a pile of rubble, he thought, well, that's no good. Like that wasn't always a pile of rubble. Once upon a time, that was a wall, or it was a chamber, or it was something else. So let's put it back together. We don't do that anymore, but that's what he did. So he's kind of got a bad reputation in some ways for that reason. Here's a shot of him at Mystery Hill with the sacrificial table and his wife, Belle. Okay, so this was great, but they wanted more. Could we find more beehives? Could we find more chambers? Could we find more evidence? So they started to really seek it out. And so that's what I've been going through the archives, looking for all the stuff they found, because they would solicit the public. They would put out ads and stuff. Like if you know of any weird stonework, write to us and tell us about it, and we'll go check it out. So sort of like what NEARA does, really. And so they did. But a lot of it never went any further than that, except it's in Goodwin's archive. So that's why I've been combing through all those old records. And they did find quite a few of them. The other thing that happened, of course, is that they were bringing in other people into their circle. They were, because people would get interested. They'd say, "Oh, I want to help. Is there anything I can do? Like, how would you like me to go check something out for you?" And so they did. So the circle of workers started to grow, and one of the big ones was this guy Vincent Fagan. Now you've probably seen his name show up in my presentation earlier because he was an architect and he was great at drawings. So the whole way that Fagan got connected to Goodwin and Pearson is through the Upton Chamber, because Vincent Fagan was a professor of architecture at Notre Dame University, he had this idea that he would write a book on the earliest architecture in America. So he was on a mission to find the earliest built-up structures in America. And he started in New England, probably, started on the right-hand side, was going to work his way to the left. And so the Upton Chamber was one of the first things he came across, because it was near where, I forget if it was his father or his brother lived, not very far, and he was visiting them. And so he said, well, while I'm here, I'm going to check out this Upton Chamber. And so that's when he met Malcolm Pearson. And so Pearson and Fagan got together with Goodwin to see Mystery Hill, and boom, like it just exploded, because Fagan was a PhD archaeologist, so he got right in there with everyone else as well, and so he supplied a lot of the drawings. Like he would go to all these different sites, like Mystery Hill and all the other chamber sites that they knew about at the time. He would make these really gorgeous, detailed architectural drawings of them. But there was a big problem when the ruins of Great Ireland in New England was published, because that Fagan was really upset, because he had in mind to do this fantastic book of architecture, and here this book came out, and it was disorganized. His drawings, his original work, was in that book. He had never given permission for them to be used in a published book, because he wanted to publish it, not have Goodwin publish it under his name. So, it was a big problem. He kind of backed away from the team after that. So there were ups and there were downs in this whole thing. But they kept on going. So 1946, Goodwin only lived 4 more years. And he did a lot of work during that time, but his health was also failing. And he did die in 1950. But you can imagine the vacuum that left, because not only Pearson and Fagan, but many other people that I don't have time to get into tonight, they were all working together, and they were finding all these incredibly fascinating ruins and trying to explain them. And they had theories, and they were trying to connect the dots. And then, but Goodwin was at the center of it, the whole thing. And suddenly, he's gone. He's dead. There's a total vacuum. And so, how do we solve this? We just can't go back and forget it, pretend it never happened. We've got to find a way to continue this important work. So that's when they had the idea, well, we need an association. We need a formal association that we can have a way of working together. We can have conferences. We can have a journal. We can have a newsletter. We can have a membership list. And that's how it started. It wasn't started as NEARA at first. At first, it was called the Early Sites Research Society. And as you can imagine, it wasn't very long before egos got in the way. Politics started, disagreements, splits. It's kind of messy. Those first few years are kind of messy. But then the heavens opened, the skies cleared. NEARA was actually founded as a formal organization. Okay, I'm whitewashing it, but if you were there for Dennis Stone's presentation today, Robert Stone is his father. He was really the founder of NEARA in 1965 or 64, whichever it was. And so, as they say, the rest is history.
Repeat what you just said about Dennis today. I didn't catch.
Dennis gave a presentation at Mystery Hill today for part of a NEARA field trip, and he talked about those first meetings of the people in NEARA, like the very first NEARA members and the meetings they held, and their newsletter, volume 1 of the journal, and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so it was a great talk, and I'm not sure if it's going to be given again in some form, but if you go to Mystery Hill and ask to see Dennis, he'll give you lots of background. He loves doing that.
And the fact that the first meeting was in the playroom.
Yeah, the rec room at the Stone home. Playroom, yeah.
I was just in the Fitchburg Mass History Historical Society the other day, and I found a little pamphlet that the woman brought up in a folder, archaeology folder. It's the first 10 years of early sites research.
Okay,
Document.
excellent.
The files.
Yeah.
Copies.
If the rest of you didn't hear what Matt Adams just said, he said that there's a document that he found in the archives that gives a summary of all the activities of early sites research society. So that'd be great to have in the NEARA archives. Thank you, Matt. So yeah, so that's what I've made it kind of my little research project, is to go through all the different places that have records from those days, whether they were authored by Goodwin himself or the other people that he was corresponding with. And I think there's about 36,000 pages worth, and I think I'm somewhere around 28,000 pages in my files at the moment. So I still have a few thousand pages to go, but I'm going to get there.
It's his personal secretary. I got
He had a female secretaries, and they were just stenographers. They didn't have any interest in history or archaeology or anything. It was just a job, like type it up and go home. And he went through several. Yeah, it wasn't just, it was not easy. Usually they would leave because they got married, and that's usually. So yeah, so some of the correspondence, I put up a few names that I've either already mentioned or are pretty famous you might recognize, but the list is a lot longer than this, really. So currently, I've been going through 39 boxes at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. It used to be called the Connecticut Historical Society. We just recently changed the name, but it's a beautiful building, historic building in Hartford on number 1 Elizabeth Street. It's worth a visit if you want to check it out sometime. And they even wrote an article on me because I go there usually twice a year, like just ahead of the NEARA meetings, and spend 2 or 3 days like combing through their Goodwin material. And at one point they said, like, what is it that you're doing? We see you here all the time. So I told them, and they, oh, that would make a great article for our newsletter. So I'm famous now. And I now have an assistant. Greg Watt was helping me the last time I was there in July, and so the librarian or the archivist said, "Can I take your photo?" And so she snapped a photo of the two of us. And this is how we do it. We've got our cameras on these tripods, and we've got our boxes of documents, and we got remote controls. You can see I'm holding the remote control. So you put a document, press the shutter, and then put a new document and press the shutter. We do scan it like very rapidly, speed read it, just to see if there's any keywords, if it says like chamber or something like that. A lot of the documents are pretty boring, but we just photograph every single document. And then later, like in the cold months of the year, February, when I can't go out in the woods or anything, I'm at home with my chips, and I go through each image and I read it word for word, and you'd be surprised at the gems that I come across. Trying to get the whole thing organized is a little disorganized now because the files themselves are disorganized. You never know what you're going to come across. But anyway, that is actually my last slide. So I thank you for bearing with me. If you have any other questions, I'd be happy to take them. Yes, sir.
Where did you get the photos of Malcolm Pearson? Sorry, Goodwin.
Oh, well, those photos were in the Goodwin archives. The one of Malcolm, I think I actually got from the NEARA archives. I think I was, before Walter took over the NEARA archives, they were at the Concord, not the Concord, but the New Hampshire Institute of Technology. And I went there one time and I just went through the entire collection, photographed everything, just like I do in Connecticut. And that photo of Malcolm was in that collection, so you can still get it, I think, in the NEARA site DB. But the ones of Goodwin, there are quite a few photos of Goodwin in the Goodwin archives themselves. Yeah.
Goodwin University.
It's relatives in the family. He was not the wealthiest Goodwin. He was kind of middle of the road. There were much more famous, much wealthier Goodwins in the family that he was kind of vaguely related to, and so there's Goodwin. I think there's Francis Goodwin Park in Hartford, which was his father. His father bequeathed a large sum of money to be used to create a public park in Hartford.
James L. Did you know what the James L. Goodwin?
I don't know that name now.
Comment about those axes that they were in Guysborough.
The one axe that Goodwin purchased from James Patrick Nolan was found in Guysborough County. I've got a whole talk on the axe. Mm-hmm.
1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and his ancestors came from the Scottish Islands.
Okay.
To me, they could have brought them with them.
Right. Something like that undoubtedly happened. Yes, you're correct. Yeah.
And my mother's born in 1963, and all her brothers.
If you want the short story on that axe, a farmer in Grover's Cove, his mother was walking in the woods near the shore. She saw something in the pine needles at her feet. Actually, she stubbed her toe on it, and she picked it up, and it was this axe head. It still had a wooden handle in it at the time, which is a dead giveaway that it wasn't 1,000 years old. Yeah, well, she found it in the woods, so who knows how long it had sat there. But like I said, it still had the wooden handle in it. Well, although it was rotten, but so it couldn't have been more than 100 years old at that point.
Was anyone able to identify the maker's mark?
Yeah, we've got other axes from Russia and Estonia that have almost identical marks on them. Yeah.
And does anyone know where the axe head is?
No, that's a good point. As there's been false rumors that the Goodwin axe ended up at the Howland House. It's not there. It was never there. In fact, Goodwin took the Howland axe and had it in his possession until Howland House had to send a lawyer to threaten him with a lawsuit if he didn't return the Howland House axe. So the Howland House axe is back at the Howland House. The Goodwin axe is still with the Goodwins as far as we know. There's a false rumor that it went to the Athenaeum. Never did. We've double-checked that 100 times. The last mention of the axe in history that we know about was when Frederick Pohl in 1950 something, 52 or something, he went to see Annabelle Goodwin, and he asked her, do you still have the axe? And she said yes. And he said, would you donate it to the museum in Halifax? And she said yes. However, he didn't see the axe. She didn't donate it. Did she just say yes and had no idea what he was talking about? We don't know. But that's the last mention of it in print, that when he interviewed Annabelle, Frederick Pohl.
Do you have an opinion of what that gentleman thought the inscription was about divine protection?
I think he was not trying to be, wasn't trying to just make up fantasy. He really believed in what he was doing, but he was just overreaching. Like you can try hard enough to make it say something intelligible and eventually find it. I don't think it genuinely has a message. No, it's like seeing rabbits in the clouds, right? You try hard enough, you can see a rabbit in the clouds or a whale, but it's not really there. There is no real rabbit in the clouds.
Has anyone looked to find sites that you identified in papers? Does anyone, got, check to see if they still exist, or if they ever existed?
Yeah, I mean, most of them are ones we know about in NEARA. It's my goal to try to see if any slip through the cracks. And there were a few that I found in going through the records that I don't think are in the NEARA database. And I've tried to go back and see if I could recover some of those. So far, they've like, it's under a parking lot, or, you know, so far I don't have pay dirt on any of that, but maybe eventually I will. But I'm the guy doing that. I'm not sure if anyone else.
How many sites do you think, you know, on all the correspondence that you've got, how many sites have been identified?
Well, like I said, they're mostly, NEARA has identified way more than Goodwin ever knew about. That's for sure. But I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know.
Thank you.
Matt.
But unrelated. One of the actual NEARA founders, Andrew Rossovia. Is anyone aware of where his collection went?
I think Dennis Stone would probably be the person to ask. Dennis Stone mentioned him quite a bit today. He's has intimate knowledge of Andy's work. All right, that's it then. I think we're looking forward to seeing you all in the morning.